Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and my mission is to use this space to bring content to you to help you understand your struggle with food and break free from binge eating. And today I want to have a look at the role of free will. One of the most distressing things about binge eating is it feels like you're completely out of control, right? It feels like you cannot stop. So there's a real sense that you've lost any sense of free will. So when we look at what free will is the power to take action without constraint of necessity or fate. It's also the ability to choose a course of action unimpeded. So there's an element of choice and feeling like you have options that is such an important part of this experience of free will. So if I were to take this pen, for example, and this is one of those pens with 4 colours on, I've got green, black, red and blue. Now, if I want to write with this pen, I can make a choice about which colour I want to use. And so if I'm going to pick a colour now, and I'm just trying to pick a colour that without thinking about it too much, so I'm going with blue. So I just picked blue. Now my sense was that I chose blue. I wasn't impeded by the idea that the fate was already chosen, that I didn't have a choice about which colour I was going to choose, that fate had decided it for me. I felt like I decided it myself. Now there's a whole philosophical school about whether free will exists, but for the purpose of this video, we're going to assume that we do have choice and that we have this free will that we can exercise. I also didn't feel compelled to choose a particular colour. There was no judgment there. There was no thinking that, oh, I should choose one colour over the other, or if I choose that colour that means this, and it's good to choose that colour and bad to choose that colour. There was none of that noise going on. And of course we know that when it comes with food and there's a lot of anxiety and stress around your eating, that all that conversation is going to be going on, and it's getting in the way. It's impeding your ability to feel like you've just made a free choice. And so people might think that after they've binged, they're making a free choice to do better tomorrow. But I would suggest that that is like a reactionary, it's like a reflex to the binge eating. So you felt out of control in binge eating, you felt like your free will was gone, you're out the other side of it, you're feeling pretty crappy about yourself now. And so you tell yourself, tomorrow I'm going to be really strict, or tomorrow I'm only going to eat that, I'm only going to eat this. But this is probably a pattern. And so if we look at patterns and we think about this idea of cycles, like life works in cycles. We have seasons that are cycles. We go into winter and spring. Not in that order. Yes, in that order. Winter, spring, summer, autumn. We have days that are cycles. The sun rises, the sun sets, the earth moves around the sun. We've got all these things that happen that go around in cycles. And then at the individual level, as a female of a certain age, I have a monthly cycle. And that has an impact on how I feel about myself and even some of the thoughts that I have. And it's predictable. There's a predictable element to cycles, and they have this self-perpetuating energy. And when we're in a cycle, there's a lot of things that are beyond our free will. If we bring it down, like for me, even a daily cycle, I know that in the mornings, my thinking is much clearer. So I always record these videos in the morning. I know that afternoons tend to be like my lowest point, sort of energy-wise and just clarity of thought. And then I get a little boost in the evening before I go to bed. I'm more of a morning person than an evening person. That is my cycle. And yes, there are some variations, but I tend to repeat that every day. So there is a big part of what I experience throughout my day, even in as much as how I'm thinking and feeling, that is not free will. It's part of this cycle that we're caught up in that has its own energy, and we're moved along with the cycle. Now the tricky part is, if we think of emotions and thoughts as being measurable physical things, like thoughts, we know they're electrical impulses in the brain, we can see thoughts, there's neurons firing, so they have matter, they have mass. And we know that emotions create like chemical and hormonal changes in the body, so there's something measurable there. In the physical world, there's this idea of cause and effect, and cause and effect is beyond free will. So when I press the blue button on this pen has no choice, if it's made correctly, but to give me the blue nib. This pen can't decide to give me the red nib. So there's the cause, which was me selecting and pressing the blue button, and the effect is that I have a blue pen to write with. So what does it mean? It means that there are certain things that are beyond our control. It means that thoughts and emotions can have an energy of their own, or seem to have an energy of their own, that's beyond our free will. The difficulty we get into is when we have these strong emotions going on and we have these corresponding thoughts. Once we fully believe that experience, it's almost like we become that experience and we lose our free will. So if we take a binge urge, for example, if you're experiencing that agitation beforehand, that desire to binge, and then you have a thought that goes, well, I'm only going to binge anyway, at that point it feels completely inevitable. You have sealed your fate. So now it's fate that's driving your behaviour and you're going to binge. It feels impossible to stop. Have you ever had that experience where it feels like your body and your legs are sort of doing it for you? You're walking down the street and your body just seems to take you into a shop, and before you know it, you're buying binge foods, or you're sitting on the sofa and you're getting up and down to the kitchen, and it doesn't feel like you're making any conscious choices. At some point it felt inevitable and you believed it was inevitable. And once those things are kind of like together, you are in that cycle, you are in that energy that's just going to drive your behaviour to continue to binge. So for example, if we look at the binge cycle, you might have seen something similar to this at some point, but this idea that this is one of those cycles that has an energy that pushes you around. There's a cause and effect to each part of the cycle. Now, the good thing, if we then think about what we can actually do when it comes to getting in touch with our sense of free will, is we look at the cycle and we look for what we call a choice point. Where in that cycle do you think it's easier or easiest to make a different choice? So you might look at it and pick something different to me, but for me, my choice point was really working on the guilt and shame. Like deciding to create a different narrative around how I felt after my binge eating, about how I judged myself for my binge eating. Because when there's something for me about like after the binge, that there's a slight slowing down in energy. There's this desire to consume, you consume, and then for me something slows down. Yes, it doesn't feel good, but there felt like there was this gap for me to be able to think about something differently. And when you change any part of the cycle, you destabilize it. It doesn't mean the cycle is just going to disintegrate the moment you change one section of it, but you slow it down, you change its repeated pattern, because it almost gains momentum. Like the more often you go through it, like it just seems to be the harder and harder it is to break. And we all want to, let's face it, we all want to break the cycle at the point of, let's just not binge. If we don't binge, we don't have the cycle. But actually, if you look at the other points of the cycle, if you don't have those, you're reducing the chances of binge eating, or reducing the chances of feeling like you have no choice about binge eating. And another thing I'd want to say about willpower is that sometimes I think we have to wait for the emotional and mental storm to pass before we can get in touch with our sense of free will. For me, free will comes up in stillness, because when there's a lot going on, when there's busyness, when there's a lot of thoughts, when there's a lot of action, it's all that information that's going in or going on in your head is a cause that's going to have an effect, right? So it's almost like we have to reduce stimulation. We have to allow some of this energy to come down a bit, sort of mental and emotional energy to reduce, before we feel able to kind of get back in touch. And there's something as well about the stillness that I think brings up our natural intuition. And for me, that natural intuition is the seat of free will. And when we're able to get in touch with it, then we're more likely to be able to find an answer for ourselves about where do we need to put our focus, where do we need to set our intentions in order to stop perpetuating this vortex, this cycle of binge eating that we found ourselves in. And one final point about your choice points is that there's no point, but it's harder. You're making it harder for yourself if you wait until you're at your choice point to make a choice. I hope that makes sense. So what I mean is, rather than saying to yourself, when I get to this point, I'm going to do something different. Once you are observing this cycle, you can look at it and go, okay, what is it I want to be saying to myself after I binge? Or even what is it I want to be saying for myself while I'm experiencing an urge to binge, if that's where you're looking to break the cycle. There's something about rehearsing and practicing in advance. It means you are bringing a new possibility into existence beforehand. If you just think in the moment you'll be able to respond differently, when you've been around this cycle so many times, you're just going to be frustrated that you're not responding differently. So if you're looking at responding differently after the binge, what is it that you want to be telling yourself? How is it you want to feel after a binge about yourself? One of the things I like the idea of recording a video to yourself that you play and you watch after a binge, where you give yourself some reassurance, where you remind yourself what it is, where it is you want to set your intention. You could do that about any stages in the cycle, really. Like, do some journaling, something to read, something about hearing your own voice coming back at you from a different place to where you are now, if that makes sense. Because where you are now, you're just hearing your voice in that moment, which is going to be so influenced by what's just happened and how you're feeling about it. So hopefully you've got a couple of ideas here about how you might be able to get in touch with your sense of free will so that you can make choices that lead you to a greater sense of freedom, which I'm guessing is what we all want. Anyway, on that note, I'm going to leave it there. I'll see you in the next video.